He wore an old, silver-gray suit. A pair of worn plastic sandals, his longtime favorites. He slowly stepped into the bank. Upon reaching the teller counter, Mr. Lamb slowly presented his ATM card to the bank teller, requesting to withdraw a large sum of money. But when the teller looked at the card and asked him for his identification, Mr. Lamb became flustered and frantically searched his coat and trouser pockets. But his identification was nowhere to be found. His mind raced. A sense of panic welled up. He remembered leaving his house this morning and not checking if he had brought any documents. "Sir, to withdraw a large sum, you must have identification," the teller repeated impatiently. Mr. Lamb looked around. His lips moved, but no words came out. Those around him began to notice. Their gazes seemed contemptuous, assuming he was incapable of handling bank procedures himself. Every whisper, every scrutinizing glance, made him feel increasingly isolated and ashamed. A young female employee standing nearby sighed continuously. She looked Mr. Lamb up and down, then turned to a nearby colleague and said, "Where did this senile old man come from? Doesn't even know to bring his documents when withdrawing money. It's always like this, how can we handle it?" Mr. Lamb, in his confusion, couldn't understand why people were looking at him that way, with looks of suspicion and disdain. Perhaps in their eyes, he was just a poor, frail old man, with no large sum of money at all. Those standing nearby also began to murmur and gossip. No one could hide their surprise and judgment of him. A woman standing nearby, with a look of doubt, said to her friend, "I don't understand why the old man is withdrawing money, especially without any documents. Did he really forget, or does he not have any? That's true. If he really has money, why doesn't he have any documents?" A man standing nearby spoke up. "He probably wants to withdraw a large sum of money for something. But I don't believe he has that much money." Mr. Lamb listened to these words. His heart ached. Their gossip was like knives cutting into his heart. He was used to silence throughout his years of living alone. But he had never felt so disregarded. He could sense the alienation from everyone around him. From the disdainful looks to the whispered words. All were like sharp knife blades, piercing his heart. "You can come back when you have all your documents," the bank teller said impatiently, her eyes looking at him disrespectfully. Mr. Lamb could only nod. But then, a feeling of shame surged within him that he couldn't bear. He quietly retreated from the teller counter, his hand still clutching his ATM card, his heart heavy. He was lost in the vast space of the bank, not knowing where to go or what to do. He wanted to go back home, but didn't want to waste more time. He hurriedly took out his mobile phone, intending to call his son. But by an unfortunate coincidence, his old phone had run out of battery. Since when, he didn't know. He became even more desperate, looking around. He saw other customers busy with their transactions. No one paid him any mind. Once again, he was in a lonely and desperate situation. He tried borrowing the phone of a female customer standing near the counter. But when he asked for permission, the customer simply shook her head silently. Unfriendly look. "Sorry, I'm busy," the woman said without turning to look at him. The feeling of humiliation washed over him again. He continued to look for someone else to borrow a phone from. But no one was willing to help. It seemed, in everyone's eyes, he was just a bothersome old man, not worth paying attention to. Each of his steps became slower. More tiring, as if time was stretching out endlessly. He stood there amidst the crowd of strangers. Feeling like a ghost. A worthless extra. Those around him continued about their business, paying no attention to his presence. By now, the tension in Mr. Lamb's heart stemmed not only from the withdrawal situation, but also from the embarrassment about himself. The feeling of being disrespected, of being ignored, left him confused and despairing. He hadn't expected that just because of a missing document, he would have to endure such suspicion and coldness. When everything seemed to have reached a dead end, a ray of hope appeared. A young woman, wearing a simple white shirt and old jeans, entered the bank. She had long, jet-black hair and bright, shining eyes. Those eyes seemed to always be searching for connection with the people around her. She wasn't like the others, who were hurried with their transactions. She saw Mr. Lamb as soon as she stepped through the door. The student's gaze wasn't cold or distant like the other customers. She looked at Mr. Lamb for a moment, as if recognizing something in his confusion. At first glance, she showed no expression other than a slight tilt of her head before she softly stepped closer. In that moment, something warm, gentle, spread through the previously tense atmosphere. "Sir, are you all right?" the girl asked, her voice soft yet full of concern. Mr. Lamb looked up in surprise at the girl. A feeling of confusion prevented him from answering immediately, although he didn't understand why she cared about him. But her gaze made him feel a little bit comforted. He slowly replied, his voice choked with emotion, I can't withdraw money, I forgot my identification." The student didn't judge, didn't laugh. She just nodded gently and said, "It's okay. Wait a moment, sir. I have a phone, let me help you call your family." He felt as if a tiny ray of light flashed within Mr. Lamb's soul. He looked at her. A flicker of unexpected hope crept into his heart. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. But then he felt a sadness in his heart, remembering that he was standing in the bank, but couldn't do anything. The image of his son, Quan, appeared in his mind, and his anxiety grew, because he couldn't easily ask his son for help. "Go ahead, sir." The girl quickly pulled out her phone from her bag and handed it to Mr. Lamb. "Please, use my phone. I'll wait." Her voice was very gentle, not a hint of rush in it, even though she surely had things to do. Mr. Lamb looked at her, touched, but hesitated. "My dear, aren't you in a hurry?" he asked in a low, sad voice. The girl smiled and replied, "It's okay, sir. I just want to be able to help you." The student stood there, listening to Mr. Lamb's every word. Not rushing, not showing any impatience. She didn't care about the gazes of others, nor the people around her, who were still continuing their transactions hurriedly. She simply wanted to help him, that's all. Mr. Lamb dialed his son's number. But this time, the phone rang and rang, no signal. He felt a bit of worry rise in his chest. "Quan. Where are you?" he murmured. Just then, the student softly said, "Don't worry, sir, let me help you call." She gently picked up her phone, dialed a number and brought it to her ear. "Hello, is this Mr. Quan?" she asked when the call connected, her voice soft but firm. After exchanging a few words, she turned to Mr. Lamb and said, "Mr. Quan is on his way. Don't worry, sir, everything will be all right." Mr. Lamb looked at her, his heart filled with gratitude. In that moment, he clearly felt that Not all young people are impatient or cold. A young person, whether a student or anyone else, could also have kindness and compassion. And this girl, though she didn't know him, helped him in his difficult time. Gratitude welled up inside him, leaving him speechless. "Thank you so much, my dear," Mr. Lamb said, his voice thick with emotion. The girl just smiled, saying nothing more. But in her eyes, Mr. Lamb saw sincerity and kindness. About 15 minutes later, a tall man in a black suit entered. His gait strong and his gaze authoritative. Mr. Kwan walked straight to the teller counter. "Hello. I'm Kwan. What happened to my father?" he said, his voice deep but powerful. All eyes in the bank lobby turned to him. A few people immediately recognized him. Hong Kwan, president of a large corporation. One of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the city. The bank teller, who had been so impatient with Mr. Lamb earlier, now paled and stammered. "Sir, Mr. Lamb wanted to withdraw a large sum of money. But he didn't have sufficient identification. We couldn't process it." Mr. Kwan didn't waste any time. He looked directly at the bank teller and said, "My father doesn't have his identification with him. But that doesn't mean that he doesn't deserve respect. He's a longtime customer of this bank. A close acquaintance of Mr. Kim, the general manager of this bank. He's not poor. What he's doing isn't for himself, but for the community." Mr. Kwan paused. Observe the change in the eyes of those around. He continued, his voice low and resolute. "My father didn't come here to withdraw money for himself. He's doing charity work, helping the poor, the sick, those whom society sometimes forgets. I can attest to this. All the money he wanted to withdraw today will be used to help those in need." Mr. Kwan's words were like a firm declaration, revealing a secret that very few people knew. Mr. Lamb, the man they had looked at with suspicion, was actually a man of great wealth. And he never flaunted it. Mr. Kwan looked at those around him and continued. "My father isn't just wealthy in terms of money, but he's also very rich in kindness. Everything he does is for the poor, the sick, and not for personal gain." When Mr. Kwan finished speaking, the entire room fell silent. The previous tension transformed into a heavy silence. The people around, including the bank teller, now felt embarrassed. They realized they had been too hasty to judge someone they didn't understand, based only on appearances. The bank teller, who had been indifferent to Mr. Lamb, lowered her head and softly said, We apologize, sir. We didn't understand. We didn't know you were such a person." Her voice trembled. She was a little embarrassed. As if she had just realized she had made a huge mistake. A feeling of shame enveloped everyone in the bank. The surrounding customers, who had previously looked at Mr. Lamb with suspicion, now began to react differently. A man hoo-ha. Now he hung his head, his eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, sir. We didn't know you'd done so much good." The apology was uttered softly. Yet it was enough to still the entire room. No one said anything more. But everyone sensed the shift in the atmosphere. Mr. Lamb stood there. His heart couldn't help but be moved. From the initial feeling of shame, he felt a distinct change in the attitudes of those around him. Their gazes no longer held suspicion, no longer held distance, but respect, admiration. He felt relieved, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. He turned to look at the young student. who was still standing silently. She offered him a gentle smile. She didn't say anything. Only looked at him with eyes full of sympathy and comfort. A sense of peace spread through him. As if everything would be all right. And indeed, after everything was resolved. When the procedures were completed and the large sum of money was withdrawn, the father and son walked out of the bank. Mr. Lamb turned to look at Mr. Kwan. His experienced eyes shone with emotion. "Thank you, son, and that young lady too. If it weren't for her help, things might not have gone so smoothly today." Mr. Kwan patted his father's shoulder gently. His eyes, too, were filled with gratitude. "Don't worry, Dad, I understand." But Mr. Kwan couldn't help but think about that student. The one who had arrived at the right moment. And selflessly helped Mr. Lamb. Without expecting anything in return. Meanwhile, the girl, though she had done her part, still stood quietly in the bank, watching Mr. Lamb's figure recede. She didn't expect any reward or thanks. For her, helping others was a normal thing to do. But when she saw the change in the attitudes of those around her, she knew she had done the right thing. Soon, she too left the bank, not forgetting to glance at the phone she had lent Mr. Lamb. A warm, happy feeling bloomed in her chest, knowing she had made a small contribution to the change in someone's life. A few days later, while the student was hurrying to class, she received an unexpected call from an unknown number. She answered and heard, "Hello. I'm Kwan, Mr. Lamb's son. I want to thank you for helping my father that day. Thank you for your kindness and compassion." The student was surprised. She hadn't thought that her action could have such a big impact. She smiled gently and replied humbly, "I just did what I thought was right. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite you to participate in a charity project that my family is developing. This is an internship opportunity at a large charitable foundation that we operate. I believe with your kind heart, you would be an important part of our operations," Mr. Kwan said in a warm voice. The student was so surprised she was speechless. She hadn't expected that. Just because of a small act, she would receive such a big opportunity. This offer isn't just a career opportunity, but also a chance for you to pursue your dream, contribute to the community, do more meaningful things in society. Thank you so much. I really don't know what to say. This is an opportunity one never could have imagined." Mr. Kwan chuckled softly. His voice was warm. "We recognize your kind heart and want you to join us. This is the first step, so that she can accomplish things greater in life. You deserve this opportunity." After that call, the student felt her heart overflowing with joy. She not only received a career opportunity, but also gained the trust of those who had witnessed her actions. She knew that sometimes a small act can change a life. And today she had witnessed it firsthand. From then on, the student not only continued her studies, but also actively participated in charitable projects run by Mr. Lamb's family. She helped organize events, attract resources for charitable activities, and help those in need. Gradually, she became a key figure in the charitable foundation, contributing her efforts to change the lives of many people in difficulty. The story of the student and Mr. Lamb didn't stop at a single act of kindness. It spread widely throughout the community. The media started reporting on the incident. And from then on, the student became a role model for kindness and compassion. People didn't just know her as an ordinary student, but also as a compassionate young person. A shining example for the younger generation. Not only her, but also Mr. Lam and Mr. Kwan became admired figures in the community for their noble acts of charity. They didn't just help the poor, but also inspired others, making the community more aware of the value of helping others and compassion. Finally, looking back at everything that had happened, Mr. Lam felt proud of what he had done. Not just because of the money he contributed to society, but also because of the changes he brought to the lives of those around him. Those who had been reminded of kindness and empathy. The story of Mr. Lam and the student wasn't just a surprising incident on an ordinary day, but also a profound lesson about kindness, patience, and compassion. For you, those who have experienced the ups and downs of life, this story may serve as a reminder of the values that have been forged over the years. Kindness isn't always immediately rewarded, but as Mr. Lam demonstrated, his help not only brought joy to himself, but also spread inspiration to those around him. The student's action changed not just a tense situation, but also opened up new opportunities, not only for herself but also for the community. You may have faced difficult times, been misunderstood or misjudged by others. But this story reminds us to never rush to judgment about someone based on their appearance. Patience, empathy, and kindness can help us overcome any prejudice. And these values are indispensable in life, especially when age has taught us valuable lessons about appreciation and compassion. Finally, this story also sends a message about caring for and helping others without expecting anything in return. That's how we can create great changes. We can create big changes, not just for ourselves but for future generations as well. A small act can brighten a whole life. Thank you for watching. And don't forget to subscribe to the Light of Life channel to continue exploring good values with us.